Hello for my full semester and second 8 weeks classes here in the fall of 2019 for American Government. This is the third of our 5 recorded lectures that we'll have in preparation for our first exam, which we will be having on September 18th. I'm recording this on August the 29th. And so you have a few days certainly to continue to work on this and prepare for that first exam. I will also just point out that I do have older recordings that if there are times in which you'd like to get some sense of what some of these chapters are about that I have covered in the past. Actually, the most recent recordings would have been just this past summer. So you're certainly welcome to review those recordings, but I have some updates here for the fall of 2019. So Chapter 3, Federalism. And again, look at that introductory part of the text, the first couple of pages of each chapter. And so in this one, you look at that issue of what government does and why it matters. And here we're seeing a description of federalism. Throughout American history, lawmakers, politicians, and citizens have wrestled with questions about how responsibilities should be allocated across the different levels of government. And let's really hone in on that phrase there, different levels of government. And that really captures the essence of federalism. So again, time and again, when you're reviewing this chapter, thinking about federalism, come back to that phrase right there, different levels of government. And so the debate then is how many levels of government should we have, and in what particular circumstance should one level of government have more authority, have sovereignty over the other levels of government. And so coming back to this issue of jurisdiction, the power, right, or authority to interpret and apply the law. In what circumstance would the federal government, the national government, have jurisdiction? Which one would it be for state government or city or county government? So consider law enforcement and what particular circumstances involving law enforcement, involving the breaking of a particular law or potential breaking of a law, would the federal government, in this case in particular Federal Bureau of Investigation from the National Justice Department, have more authority? Or within a state, the State Highway Patrol, when would they have jurisdiction? Or county. Consider some of the different counties across the United States. Not only might counties share borders with other states, as we can certainly think of here in eastern Oklahoma, sharing a border with Arkansas or with Kansas or with Missouri, with Texas. You could then have in some parts of the country counties sharing borders with other countries. So there we can see the complexity of responsibilities at the county level. And then city. When should the city have jurisdiction? So we can certainly see the complexities of federalism by looking at these different levels of government. National, state, county, and city. And of course, here in Oklahoma, and as with some other states, you can also add in the jurisdiction of tribal authority. Now, there are different situations in which there's added complexities for federalism. In some ways, this complexity has been removed when we look at the issue of alcohol and drinking laws, although there are still differences among the states on when alcohol can be sold, what particular stores, what days, what level of alcohol. But there used to be even more differences on when people could buy that alcohol and when they could consume it based on their age. So we had a circumstance in Oklahoma where you had an uneven drinking age law. In 1976, it went to the Supreme Court to look at the issue of having 18-year-old females qualify or be legal to drink alcohol and to purchase alcohol. But for males, it would have to be 21. This is an example, the way the court concluded, Supreme Court, that this was an example of gender discrimination. It was a violation of the 14th Amendment. This is an amendment that we'll be coming back to time and again throughout this class, but especially in this chapter and then in the 4th and 5th chapters. So looking at this phrase, equal protection, when could there be circumstances in which there's not equal protection, in which there could be an acceptable form of discrimination? In this case, having uneven drinking age laws was not an acceptable level of discrimination. So then we had in the 1980s when Ronald Reagan was president, you see a picture there of President Reagan, we had a push to raise the drinking age to 21 in all states. And the process of doing that was using the federal government's economic power, fiscal power, the ability to just simply have more funding and distribute that funding to states to be able to pressure the state governments to raise their drinking age to 21. And the way to do that, according to the National Drinking Age Act, was to inform states that if they did not raise their drinking age to 21 at a particular date, roughly about the end of the 1980s, they would not receive the same level of highway funding that they had received in the past. And so states had to then make an analysis of what would be most worthwhile. The revenue perhaps that they were receiving from legal drinking for those who were the ages of 18, 19, and 20 versus the amount of funding that they would lose by not getting federal highway funding, at least to the same level that they had been receiving. And all states had made the determination that it was far more worthwhile to get the federal highway funding. So another complexity that we have for this is to look at the issue of when states must recognize the official acts of other states. And of course, this is part of the original Constitution, the full faith and credit clause. And so all states that are part of this national government must legally recognize official acts of other states. Debts of other states, when people leave, they are still required to pay those debts. And so you can imagine how chaotic the situation would be if people could just simply leave a state if they owed money in that state. And so that's not a good enough reason to be able to now avoid your debts. And so this is also telling us that we may have independence among the states, but that independence is limited. There still is a requirement when you're part of this national government to recognize the official acts of other states. And so consider marriages in one state. If they're considered to be an official marriage in that state, are they to be recognized in other states? And we've seen a same-sex marriage now is to be recognized in all states. So this does remind us that there's some limits to what states can do with the full faith and credit clause, and then also just simply the overall funding ability that the national government has. And that certainly would indicate that they have the ability to influence state and local policy. The federal government has that ability to do so. Fiscal federalism. We started to see this start to blossom, the power of the national government, even though the national government would have had power beforehand. but even more so in the ability to distribute funding through the National Income Tax Amendment, the 16th Amendment. While, as we remember from Chapter 2, the President does not directly have the ability to add an amendment to the Constitution, this is President Woodrow Wilson. He was very supportive of having a national income tax amendment. So when we look at the relationship between the national government and state governments, we can see some trade-offs on which one of those levels of government has the most power in certain areas. And then there's areas, as we can see in the middle here, concurrent powers in which the two levels share power. But even if we look at this issue here of the powers of national government and state government, there's still some questions on when perhaps the national government can override state government. So if you notice over here on state government, the area of taxes, we know that there are taxes at the national level. When it comes to protect public health and safety, is there in a way, a floor level amount of enforcement that the federal government would ensure that all states must follow? The elections have to be conducted in a fair way, and the national government may interfere with state governments if they're not conducting fair elections. And again, as I just mentioned about marriage laws, the marriages in one state would need to be recognized in other states, and the national government would enforce that to ensure that that would happen. So while the state governments do have independence, do they have the independence to a level to treat citizens or visitors into the state that might be deemed unfair or unconstitutional according to the national government? And that's where we see part of this debate on federalism. When should the states have that power, and how much independence? So for example, and this is a case that's not brought out in your text, to look at Helvering versus Davis, 1937. This is the Social Security review to determine whether or not Social Security is constitutional. One way of referring to it can be old age benefits, that people who reach a certain age are now going to qualify for these benefits. And is it constitutional? The court in 1937 ruled that it was constitutional because to not have an amount of funding at the national level that would be fairly equal and common, that it could create a nationwide calamity that you see there. The idea that people might start to shop around and move to states that would provide the best benefits. That was at least a concern. So this needs to be a national approach, and therefore the national government administering old age benefits was deemed to be constitutional. There would be unevenness to allow for each state to come up with its own old age benefits. So they need to have a fairly united process of distributing and determining the benefits. This becomes the question then of how effective implementation may take place. And so even if you have a national policy, could there possibly be differences among the states on how that national policy is administered or put to work? And so it's a very interesting way of looking at the success of a government policy, to look at its implementation. We'll come back to this term when we talk about bureaucracy in a greater amount of detail. But putting a policy to work, implementation. So you could have a national education policy. Children are to read at a certain level in every state. Let's just say that would be the policy. Well, to put that policy to work, you have to have then educators and policymakers on education in each state have a way to implement that policy. And so the effectiveness of the implementation is going to determine whether or not the policy is very successful. So pay attention to this definition of implementation. You can see there the efforts of departments and agencies to translate laws into specific bureaucratic rules and actions. Well, perhaps one of the ways of enforcing a law, putting it to work, and to make this effective is to borrow from one level of government to another. And in some parts of the country, in some areas of government, perhaps you're more effective at doing this than others. We have seen in Oklahoma, for example, the possibility of using what's referred to as cross-deputization. So you could have sheriff deputies working for a tribe and perhaps vice versa. So consider this county that I'm recording this lecture in, Ottawa County. Several different tribal headquarters here, tribal lands, and so you now have this way of trying to determine what who would have what jurisdiction. And so perhaps the more effective way of doing that, if there was going to be an event on tribal land, a lot of people, need for security, is to, instead of just having a limited number of police officers for that one tribe, you can now cross-deputize, and you could have individuals who are working for the Ottawa County Sheriff's Department also work for a particular tribe. And so this may be a very effective way of implementation to ensure that you're able to succeed in goals and using the different levels of government. And of course, one of the things that we see in this part of the country with several different tribal headquarters and tribal governments is that we know, and this is brought out in the Constitution, that the primary level of government that American Indian tribes have worked with the most throughout their history has been the federal government. That may be changing in some circumstances now, in which there's a greater relationship with local governments and state governments. But throughout a good portion of history here, the largest portion of history, it's clearly been an ongoing relationship. And we certainly, I think most of us are probably familiar with the history, not a real positive relationship for the tribes in working with the federal government. So that's outlined right there in the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8. So the Congress shall have power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. We can see in the second half of this chapter a greater emphasis then on looking at the power of the federal government through the process of administering funding. And so looking at grants. We have different types of grants that serve different purposes. And starting on page 91, you can look at the categorical grant. And this is where you see many institutions that may have people on staff whose job is to write grants. And so in the process of writing grants, you can see there what is needed in that grant. This becomes an area of competition, and there has to be a considerable amount of explanation and specific goals that are detailed in order to receive the grant. Formula grant, as we can see here, just like the name suggests, there has to be a formula that has to be determined and used to see how successful a state or local government will be in order to receive that grant. There's debates in this area, as we can imagine, and one of the debates is just how much authority should the federal government have in how the grants are used and to determine how the grants have been successful. And so there's that question of the power of the national government. Once they've administered the funding, do they also get to determine just how well the funding's been used? Now, we can see that there can be abuse by local and state governments if they're not being monitored. But at the same time, we may also see that the more review that's in place by the national government, it may also limit state and local governments in their ability to be successful. So there's certainly a need to try to find that balance between granting authority and granting freedom and liberty to use the grants versus the importance to monitor how the grants are being used. So one of the better known examples of a block grant where we can see there's less strings attached is the Community Development Block Grant. So just like the name suggests, it's used for community development, has some broad outlines in it, and then it's pretty much up to the state or local government to determine how that money will be spent. So for example, for downtown improvement, the city of Miami a few years back got a community development block grant to change the main street of Miami. And so that was a grant that had some limited strings in the process of making those changes for downtown Miami. Well, when you look at the use of the national government and in determining what the national government can do according to the Constitution, you may have some very broad powers, some very elastic powers as they're described. You can read about that on pages 87 and 88. So for example, the issue of building, when it comes to national banking and a national economic policy, can there be a national bank? And so that's not specifically described in the text, in the Constitution. So if that's the case, what is the legal and constitutional support for a national bank? And it can be found in the Commerce Clause, according to the interpretation of the Supreme Court with this case, McCulloch v. Maryland. So certainly read about that on pages 87 and 88. If the Constitution does say that Congress has the power to lay and collect taxes, borrow money, regulate commerce, could not then the Congress also determine that the most effective way to carry out those powers is to establish a national bank? And in the process then, would not the national bank be considered constitutional? So this is where you have an elastic description of power for the national government, specifically the Congress. So read about this phrase, the necessary and proper clause, in Article 1, Section 8 there in your text. One of the ways of looking at that is I use the phrase elastic. It can really be stretched to cover lots of different areas in involving the national government. And as a consequence of that, we've now had a Federal Reserve banking system. And with all that being said, is it ultimately best to have that? It does give some individuals tremendous power in our economic system in the United States. But does it also ensure that we have a more consistent banking policy as well? So it's important to take both of those into consideration and read about the power of the bank, pages 650, 651. In our history, we had a major conflict involving the bank, and during the presidency of Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was an opponent of the national bank. He could clearly see reasons to not support it, primarily from a democratic point of view, that you were giving tremendous amounts of power to unelected individuals in the country. And there is no way avoiding that. That is indeed true. But does it also mean that if you didn't have this national bank, they could administer funds from one part of the country to another to try to ensure that there would not be over speculation in some parts of the country, to try to make sure that you had a fairly balanced way of administering funds across the country, that you could avoid major banking failures? And so that's the trade-off. So it is part to say, yes, Jackson got rid of having unelected individuals with tremendous amounts of power and money in our national banking system, but it also meant in the late 1830s we had a national banking, an overall banking calamity and a depression in the country. And so people also lost funding as a result of that. So there is, I think, a very important way of considering what it means to not have a national banking system and what that might mean for people's savings and protections of their funding in a bank. And the last point that we can see there then is to look at the Commerce Clause and what it might mean if there's a conflict between between two or more states, I should say. And does that then mean that the federal government is going to be the referee that's going to step in and make the determination on that interaction between the states when it comes to commerce? And that's brought out in this case, Gibbons v. Ogden, page 87 in your text. It comes back to the question of the Commerce Clause and how do we ensure a fair relationship among states when it comes to trade. All right, we'll stop there and we'll continue on with Chapter 4, looking at civil liberties in our next recorded lecture.